The convergence chamber stretched across 3 kilometers of polished obsidian, because apparently when you've mastered faster-than-light travel and conquered death itself, you still need to compensate for something. 12 species sat in judgment today, each more ancient and allegedly wiser than the last, their collective age spanning roughly 47 million years, give or take a few epochs. At the center of this architectural monument to ego stood a single human female, barely 25 years old by her species' laughably brief standards. She wore the standard-issue prisoner's restraints, energy shackles that hummed with enough power to level a small moon, though frankly the real restraint was probably just good manners. The assembled elders had seen what happened when humans stopped being polite. Elder Yithkala of the Crystalline Dominion spoke first, his voice resonating through translation matrices that somehow made even his most profound thoughts sound like a tax audit. We gather today to address the most egregious breach of galactic protocol in the recorded history of civilized space. A pause, presumably for dramatic effect, though with a lifespan measured in geological ages. His sense of timing left something to be desired. The defendant stands accused of the unthinkable crime of... He actually hesitated. A being who had witnessed the birth and death of 17 star systems, who had negotiated peace treaties with entities made of pure mathematics, who had once stared down a black hole and convinced it to relocate to a more convenient neighborhood. This venerable ancient could barely bring himself to say the words, "Help." The chamber fell silent except for the gentle hum of life support systems working overtime to accommodate 12 different atmospheric requirements. Somewhere in the back, a young hegemony officer's breathing apparatus wheezed what might have been suppressed laughter. Elder Vextai, whose people had transcended physical form sometime around the invention of the wheel on most worlds, manifested his disapproval as a localized aurora, not merely helping colleague. Unauthorized helping, unsanctioned helping, helping without proper permits, impact assessments or committee approval. The human call her warrior, since that was apparently all the designation the galaxy had bothered to assign her people before they'd made the mistake of actually getting to know them, shifted her weight and managed to look simultaneously bored and dangerous. It was a peculiarly human expression that had been giving the galaxy nightmares for the better part of 2 decades. To summarize the defendant's crimes, intoned Elder Quendara, whose species communicated primarily through interpretive biochemical cascades that smelled faintly of old cheese, she encountered a Jekatari colony ship experiencing catastrophic life support failure. Instead of following proper procedures, filing a report, requesting permission to intervene, waiting for the Committee on Alien Welfare to convene and debate the appropriate response over the next 6 months, she acted immediately. The word immediately was pronounced with the same tone one might use to describe a particularly virulent plague. She diverted her patrol vessel, continued another elder, this one resembling a dignified jellyfish in a pressure suit, performed 17 hours of continuous manual repairs in the vacuum of space, and single-handedly prevented the deaths of 4,000 Jekatari civilians. A pause. Without authorization, Warrior finally spoke, her voice carrying that particular human quality that made advanced civilizations question their life choices. They were done. That, replied Elder Yithkala with the patience of someone who had explained this same concept roughly 800 times to various humans over the years, is not your determination to make. We have established protocols for exactly these scenarios. The Jekatari colony was beyond the designated rescue perimeter. Their situation fell under the jurisdiction of Sector Council 7, which was scheduled to address their plight after completing their current deliberations on standardized airlock dimensions. Which would have taken how long? Warrior asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. 4 to 6 standard months, assuming no appeals process. They had 6 hours of air left. The elders exchanged the sort of meaningful looks that civilizations perfect after spending millennia learning to communicate disappointment across species barriers. Elder Yithkala's crystalline features somehow managed to convey profound sorrow at humanity's persistent failure to understand basic concepts like bureaucratic procedure and the natural order of things. This, he said finally, is precisely why your species remains classified as dangerously primitive. You act on instinct. You prioritize immediate emotional responses over systematic evaluation. You show reckless disregard for established authority structure. He gestured toward the assembled council. We have spent millions of years perfecting these systems. The galaxy operates smoothly because we have learned to think before we act, to consider all implications before we intervene. Right, warrior said. And how many people died while you were thinking? The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as awkwardness to developing civilizations. Elder Vix Ty's aurora flickered irritably. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few who happen to be suffocating right in front of you. Got it. Warrior's smile was the sort of expression that made advanced civilizations remember why they'd evolved past having nightmares. So what's the verdict, elders? Community serve anger management classes. A strongly worded letter to my commanding officer. Elder Yithkala rose, or rather his platform elevated him several meters above the assembly, because subtlety was apparently another concept that got lost somewhere between immortality and cosmic significance. By unanimous decision of this tribunal, you are hereby sentenced to exile beyond the galactic rim, to the unmarked territories where your instincts can cause no further disruption to civilized space. The chamber stirred. Exile beyond the rim was essentially a death sentence delivered with paperwork. The unmarked territories were where space itself seemed to develop trust issues. Furthermore, Elder Quindara added, her biochemical emanations now smelling distinctly of satisfied bureaucrat. This sentence is to be carried out immediately, without possibility of appeal, communication, or rescue attempt. That was when the voice from the gallery spoke up, young and nervous but determined in the way that made seasoned warriors either very proud or very concerned. I volunteer to accompany the exile. 12 ancient civilizations turned their attention toward the source of this latest disruption to their perfectly ordered proceeding. In the observers section, standing at attention despite the obvious trembling in his legs, was the youngest member of the Human Defense Corps ever to set foot in the convergence chamber. He looked about 19, which in human terms meant he was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Given his species, it was probably both. Elder Yithkala's voice carried the sort of weary disbelief that came from dealing with humans for 2 decades. I beg your pardon, Galactic Code 77 Alpha, the young warrior said, his voice cracking slightly, but his posture remaining rigid. Any citizen has the right to voluntarily share an exile sentence, provided they accept full responsibility for the consequences and waive all claims to rescue or retrieval. The elders looked at each other with the sort of expression that usually preceded the phrase, we should have seen this coming. Elder Vix Ty's aurora shifted to what could only be described as bureaucratic migraine colors. That code, he said carefully, was written approximately 30,000 years ago, and has never been invoked. But it's still valid. A long pause. The sort of pause that civilizations use when they're trying to figure out how to explain to someone that just because something is technically legal doesn't mean it's a good idea. Yes, Elder Yithkala admitted finally, it remains valid. Warrior turned to look at her unexpected volunteer, her expression shifting from amusement to something that might have been concern. Kid, do you have any idea what you just signed up for? The young warrior's grin was pure human optimism, the kind that had been making the galaxy nervous since the species had first figured out how to leave their home system. Not really, but it seemed like the right thing to do, and there it was, Elder Yithkala reflected as he watched the 2 humans being led away to their transport. That phrase, the right thing to do, had been giving the civilized galaxy administrative headaches for 2 decades running. They acted on instinct, without proper authorization, based on some internal moral compass that seemed to point toward chaos. The truly terrifying part was that they kept being right. The holding cells beneath the convergence chamber were designed with the same aesthetic sensibilities that had produced the courtroom above, which is to say they managed to make imprisonment feel like a particularly uncomfortable art installation. The walls were a soothing shade of bureaucratic beige that somehow made even the concept of color seem like it needed proper authorization. Warrior sat cross-legged on what passed for a bench, watching her unexpected cellmate pace back and forth in what appeared to be a carefully measured pattern. 7 steps to the left, pivot, 7 steps to the right, pivot, repeat. Either he was working out some complex mathematical problem, or he was having second thoughts about volunteering to share a death sentence with a complete stranger. You know, she said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched for approximately 23 minutes and 47 seconds. Not that she was counting, there's still time to back out. Pretty sure the elders would be thrilled to process your withdrawal form. Probably take them 6 months to approve it, But eventually, the young warrior stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression carrying that particular mix of determination and barely controlled terror that was apparently standard issue for his generation. "I'm not backing out. Right? And you did this because..." He resumed pacing, though now his pattern seemed less mathematical and more like someone trying to walk off nervous energy. "Because someone needed to. That's not an answer, kid. That's a campaign slogan. My name's Davin," he said, stopping again to face her. "And I watched the footage from the Jektari rescue. All 17 hours of it. Ah, there it was. The footage that the Defense Corps had tried to classify, bury and generally pretend didn't exist. 17 hours of a single human performing what the galaxy's greatest engineers had declared impossible. Manually repairing a failing life support system in hard vacuum while juggling the atmospheric needs of a species that breathed liquid methane. Impressive camera work, Warrior said dryly, though I think they could have cut out the part where I nearly vented myself into space. Twice. That's just it, Davin said, his voice gaining confidence as he found his footing in the conversation. You didn't hesitate. Not once. 4,000 lives hanging in the balance, and you did what needed doing. And that made you want to follow me into the void because that's what we're supposed to do. He said it with the sort of simple conviction that had probably given his instructors either great pride or severe headaches. Help people, save lives, do the right thing. A pause. Even when it's not authorized. Warriors studied him for a moment, taking in the regulation haircut, the pressed uniform, the way he held himself like someone who'd spent years learning to follow orders, and was only now discovering what it meant to make his own decisions. How old are you, Davin? 19 standard. And how long have you been in the Corps? 3 months. 2 weeks. 4 days. The precision suggested he'd been counting every one of them. Right. So you've had exactly 0 real combat experience. Probably never been off station for longer than a training exercise. And your grand total of life or death decisions amounts to what, choosing between the chicken or the beef in the mess hall. Davin's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. That's correct. And you thought following me into unmarked space was a good career move because someone who's been in the Corps for 3 months, 2 weeks and 4 days, doesn't get to make career moves, he said, his tone shifting from defensive to matter-of-fact. I get to follow orders, file reports, and learn how to properly maintain equipment I'll probably never use. But this, he gestured toward the cell walls, toward everything beyond them. This is the first time I've had a chance to actually do something that matters. The outer door chimed, and a procession of beings entered that would have made a xenobiology convention weep with envy. 3 guards, 1 crystalline, 1 gaseous, 1 that appeared to be made entirely of geometric theorems, followed by a clerk whose species had evolved past the need for a consistent number of limbs. Prisoners designated for Exile 777, the clerk announced, consulting a tablet that flickered through 17 different scripts before settling on something resembling standard Galactic. Transport preparation requires individual biometric confirmation, psychological evaluation, and execution of final documentation. Execution of documentation, Warrior muttered. Right, because signing papers doesn't sound nearly ominous enough. The psychological evaluation turned out to be a series of questions that seemed designed by committee, which given the galactic bureaucracy they probably had been. Did the subjects understand the irreversible nature of their situation? Did they comprehend the minimal probability of survival beyond the galactic rim? Also yes, did they wish to record final messages for transmission to their species governing body? Tell them, Warrior said to the recording device, that their newest exile says hello, and that the next time they encounter a species suffocating in space, they should maybe consider helping first and filling out the paperwork later. Davin's message was shorter but somehow more unsettling. Tell them I said thank you for the chance to find out what kind of person I really am. The transport ship was exactly what one might expect from a vessel designed to carry exiles into the void. Functional, uncomfortable, and equipped with just enough supplies to make the journey feel like cruel optimism rather than outright execution. The cargo bay had been converted into living quarters that would have made a prison cell feel spacious,
and the navigation system had been locked to prevent any creative detours back to civilized space. Estimated time to rim boundary, announced the ship's AI in a tone that suggested it had drawn the short straw among artificial intelligences. 72 standard hours. Estimated survival time beyond rim boundary, insufficient data for calculation. Cheerful, Davin observed, settling into what passed for a co-pilot seat. I'm starting to see why they use this for Exile rather than passenger service. Warrior was examining the supply manifests with the sort of attention usually reserved for sacred texts or suspicious financial documents. 3 months of rations, basic medical supplies, and a survival kit that appears to have been assembled by someone who thinks roughing it means staying at a hotel without room service. She looked up from the tablet. Either they're being optimistic about our chances, or they're really committed to the whole slow death aesthetic. Maybe they figure we'll find something out there, Davin suggested. The unmarked territories are got to be planets, resources, maybe even other species that haven't made contact yet. Or maybe, Warrior said, settling into her own seat as the transport began its departure sequence. They figure that anything we find out there is our problem now, not theirs. The ship shuddered as it cleared the station's docking bay, and through the narrow viewport, the stars began their familiar shift from points of light to streaks of possibility. Behind them, the vast machinery of galactic civilization hummed along with the comfortable efficiency of a system that had spent millions of years perfecting the art of not having to deal with problems directly. Ahead lay the rim, and beyond that the unmarked territories where space itself seemed to develop trust issues. So, Davin said as they settled in for the journey, what's the plan once we get there? Warrior's smile was the sort of expression that had been making the galaxy nervous for 2 decades running. Kid, that's the beautiful thing about being exiled beyond the reaches of civilized space. For the first time in years, I don't need a plan. I don't need authorization. I don't need to file a report or wait for committee approval. She leaned back in her seat, watching the stars streak past. I just get to see what happens when humans stop following the rules. The ship's AI made a sound that might have been electronic clearing of a throat, if AIs had throats to clear. For the record, this unit would like to note its official disapproval of any activities that might void its warranty. Noted, Warrior said cheerfully, and ignored. Behind them, the galaxy continued its stately rotation, secure in the knowledge that it had successfully dealt with yet another human-shaped problem. The truly terrifying part was that it actually believed it had won.
73 hours and 14 minutes after departure. Not that anyone was counting, except possibly the ship's AI, which seemed to have developed an unhealthy obsession with precise temporal measurements. They crossed the galactic rim. The transition wasn't marked by fanfare, cosmic phenomena, or even a decent light show. One moment they were traveling through space that had been mapped, catalogued, and bureaucratically organized into neat sectors, and the next they were officially nowhere according to every authority that mattered. The navigation display simply switched from showing their position relative to known stellar landmarks to displaying what could only be described as a cosmic shrug. Well, Davin observed, staring at the viewport where the stars had resumed their normal stationary appearance. That was anticlimactic. What did you expect? Warrior asked from her position at the engineering console, where she'd spent the last several hours performing maintenance that the ship's manual insisted was both unnecessary and inadvisable. A big sign saying "Welcome to the Void, population unknown." Maybe a little ominous music, some dramatic lighting. Something to mark the occasion. The ship's AI chose that moment to contribute its thoughts. This unit would like to note that we have officially exceeded our approved operational parameters by approximately 47 million kilometers. All subsequent activities will be conducted without warranty, technical support, or reasonable expectation of rescue. Noted, Warrior replied, not looking up from her work, and still ignored. 3 days into their journey through unmarked space, they discovered their first indication that the galaxy's understanding of the void might have been somewhat incomplete. It came in the form of a debris field that shouldn't have existed. Not because debris fields were particularly rare, but because this one appeared to be composed entirely of materials that galactic science insisted were impossible. "Are you seeing this?" Davin asked, his voice carrying the sort of excitement that usually preceded either great discoveries or terrible mistakes. Warrior moved to the sensor station and began scrolling through readings that seemed to have been generated by equipment having some kind of existential crisis. According to these scans, that debris is made of crystallized gravity, metallic time, and what appears to be compressed probability. That's impossible. Yeah, well, apparently nobody told the debris that. She looked up from the display. Want to take a closer look? The supply manual specifically advises against investigating anomalous phenomena. The AI interjected helpfully. Good thing we're not following the manual anymore, Warrior said, already plotting an intercept course. The debris field turned out to be the remains of something that had once been a ship, though calling it a ship was like calling a symphony a collection of organized noise. Technically accurate, but missing the point entirely. The wreckage suggested a design philosophy that treated the fundamental laws of physics more like gentle suggestions than absolute requirements. How is this possible? Davin asked as they maneuvered through chunks of hull that seemed to shift between solid matter and pure energy, depending on the angle of observation. Maybe, Warrior said, carefully collecting samples with the ship's manipulator arms. The galaxy doesn't know everything it thinks it knows. They spent 6 hours documenting the wreckage before moving on, but not before downloading what appeared to be a data core that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. The ship's computer spent the next 2 days trying to process it before giving up and filing it under anomalous data contents unknown, probably dangerous. The second discovery came a week later, when their long-range sensors detected something that registered as both a planet and a star, depending on which instrument was doing the detecting. According to their navigation system, it was roughly the size of a small moon. According to their gravitational sensors, it had the mass of a gas giant. According to their optical scanners, it didn't exist at all. I'm starting to think, Davin said as they watched the impossible object grow larger on their screens, that maybe the elders banished us to the wrong place. Or maybe, Warrior replied, they banished us to exactly the right place, and they just didn't realize it. The planet-star non-existent object turned out to be inhabited. The life forms they encountered defied classification in ways that would have given galactic xenobiologists nervous breakdowns, assuming they could have observed them without their instruments catching fire from logical contradictions. Greetings, travelers from the bounded spaces. One of the entities communicated, its message arriving through channels that bypassed their communication equipment entirely, and appeared directly in their minds as fully formed concepts. We have observed your kind before, though rarely do any venture beyond the rim of their small certainties. You've seen humans before, Warrior asked, speaking aloud since she had no idea how to think back at something that existed as a living equation. Not your species specifically. Your approach, your willingness to act without understanding, to help without authorization, to exist without requiring the universe's permission. The entity's amusement manifested as a localized aurora that tasted faintly of cosmic irony. The bounded ones fear such behavior. They prefer their realities organized, cataloged, and properly filed. The bounded ones, Davin asked, those who have learned to exist safely within the structures they have built to contain the infinite. They are very proud of their systems, their councils, their careful processes for managing the unexpected. They have spent eons perfecting the art of never being surprised. Warrior felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. And that's a problem because reality, the entity replied with what might have been fond exasperation, has never shown much respect for filing systems. Over the following days, the entity who insisted on being called Navigator, though it clearly existed in more dimensions than any reasonable navigation system could accommodate, shared knowledge that would have revolutionized galactic understanding of physics, consciousness, and the fundamental nature of existence. It also shared some excellent recipes for converting quantum uncertainty into something resembling coffee, which Davin declared was the most practical discovery they'd made so far. Your bounded ones believe they have reached the pinnacle of advancement, Navigator explained during one of their conversations, which took place in a pocket of folded space-time that existed primarily as an abstract concept. They have conquered death, mastered energy, and organized reality according to their preferences, but in doing so, they have forgotten the most important truth, which is, Warrior asked, that the universe is not a problem to be solved, it is an adventure to be experienced. The elders would hate that philosophy, Davin observed. The elders, Navigator replied with what definitely sounded like amusement, would file it under unproductive thinking, contains unauthorized wonder. As their time with Navigator drew to a close, something about temporal currents and the need to maintain dimensional stability, Warrior found herself understanding something that had been nagging at her since the trial. The galaxy's great civilizations hadn't advanced beyond the need for adventure and discovery. They had simply become too afraid of the consequences to allow themselves to experience either. "You know what's funny?" she said to Davin as they prepared to leave Navigator's impossible planet. "The elders sentenced us to exile because they thought we were too primitive to understand their advanced systems. But maybe the real problem is that their systems are too primitive to understand us." "How so?" "They've spent millions of years learning how to manage the predictable, but humans specialize in dealing with the impossible." She gestured toward the viewport, where Navigator's planet was performing its daily transformation from solid matter to pure potential, and back again. "Out here where their rules don't apply, we're not the primitive ones anymore." Davin followed her gaze, watching reality reshape itself according to principles that would have required 17 committees and a formal impact assessment back in civilized space. "So what does that make us?" Warrior's smile was the sort of expression that had been making the galaxy nervous for 2 decades running, though for the first time she was beginning to suspect that maybe the galaxy had good reason to be nervous. "That makes us exactly what we've always been, kid. The species that doesn't know enough to know when something is impossible. And that's a good thing." Out here, she watched as Navigator bid them farewell by temporarily rearranging the local star patterns to spell out safe travels in a language that existed only as pure meaning. Out here, that might just be the most advanced trait in the universe. Their ship turned away from the impossible planet and headed deeper into the unmarked territories, carrying with it data that would revolutionize galactic understanding of reality itself, assuming of course that anyone back in civilized space would be willing to believe it. The truly terrifying part was that they probably wouldn't be. 6 months after their exile, though time had become somewhat negotiable in a region of space where Tuesday occasionally happened before Monday, and Navigator had mentioned something about temporal loops that made yesterday arrive next week, their ship's communication array began receiving signals from civilized space. The first transmission was a standard automated beacon update, the kind of routine data burst that kept galactic navigation systems synchronized. The second was an emergency broadcast that made Warriors sit up and take notice. The third made her start laughing in a way that suggested either enlightenment or complete psychological breakdown. "What's so funny?" Davin asked, looking up from his daily review of their impossible data collection, which now included 17 different proofs that faster-than-light travel was mathematically impossible, recorded during actual faster-than-light travel. "Listen to this," Warrior said, activating the ship's main display. The emergency broadcast filled their small cabin with the unmistakable sound of galactic civilization having what could only be described as a panic attack. "Catastrophic failure of dimensional barriers in sectors 7 through 15. A harried voice was reporting. "Reality incursions increasing at a rate of 47% per standard day. The Council of Elders has declared a state of cosmic emergency and is requesting immediate assistance from any entities capable of managing impossible phenomena." The transmission cut to Elder Yithkala himself, looking considerably less composed than during their trial. His crystalline features flickered with stress patterns that suggested he hadn't had a proper geological rest period in weeks. "To any recipients of this transmission," he began, his voice carrying the sort of desperate authority that comes from watching one's carefully ordered universe begin operating, according to principles that definitely weren't in the manual. "The galactic community faces an unprecedented crisis. Phenomena consistent with unmarked territory anomalies are manifesting within civilized space. Our greatest minds are unable to formulate appropriate responses to situations that appear to violate fundamental laws of physics, causality, and administrative procedure." "Oh, this is rich," Warrior muttered. "We are particularly seeking contact with any individuals who have demonstrated experience in unauthorized problem solving, especially those with a history of ignoring proper protocols in favor of immediate action." A pause that somehow managed to convey both cosmic embarrassment and desperate hope. "Any such individuals should report immediately to Convergence Station for emergency consultation." The transmission ended with coordinates and a priority authorization code that would have made Davin's former instructors weep with envy. "They're asking for help," he said, staring at the display with something approaching wonder. "The same people who exiled us for helping are now asking us to come back and help some more." "Not just asking," Warrior observed, already plotting a course back towards civilized space.
Elder Yathkala just used the phrase unauthorized problem solving as if it were a desirable job qualification. So what do we do? Warrior's smile was the sort of expression that had been making the galaxy nervous for 2 decades, though now it carried an additional note of vindication that would have made lesser civilizations reconsider their life choices. We go home, kid. Time to show the galaxy what happens when you actually need the species that doesn't know enough to know when something is impossible. The journey back to civilized space took considerably less time than their original exile, partly because they now had navigators' improvements to their engine systems, and partly because reality seemed to be developing a sense of dramatic timing. They arrived at Convergence Station to find it in a state of controlled chaos that would have been impressive if it weren't so obviously terrifying to the beings trying to control it. Sections of the station existed in 17 different time streams simultaneously. The main docking bay had been converted into a probability stabilization field that made approaching ships flicker between existing and not existing until they committed to a final state. And the convergence chamber itself had apparently been relocated to a parallel dimension, after what the emergency reports described as an unfortunate incident involving weaponized iron. Unauthorized personnel approaching station control, their ship's communication system announced with considerably more enthusiasm than it had shown during their exile. Please identify yourselves and state your business. This is the transport vessel carrying Exiles designated 7-7. Warrior replied, her voice carefully neutral. We're responding to your emergency consultation request. The pause that followed was so long that Davin began to wonder if the communication array had malfunctioned. Finally, a voice that sounded suspiciously like Elder Yathkala replied, though he seemed to be speaking through some kind of dimensional filter that made him sound slightly less dignified than usual. Please proceed immediately to Emergency Dock 7. A full diplomatic escort will be waiting. Diplomatic escort? Davin asked as they maneuvered through the chaos of the station's approach vectors. Translation: they want to make sure we don't do anything unauthorized while we're helping them with their unauthorized problems. Warrior explained. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a properly filed requisition form. Emergency Dock 7 turned out to be staffed by a committee of beings who looked like they'd spent the last 6 months trying to solve problems using procedures designed for a universe that followed rules. The delegation was led by Elder Yathkala himself, who had apparently been promoted from disappointed authority figure to desperately grateful authority figure since their last meeting. Welcome back, he said, his crystalline features managing to convey both relief and cosmic embarrassment. We trust your time in the unmarked territories was educational. Very, Warrior replied cheerfully. We learned all sorts of interesting things about reality, consciousness, and the fundamental nature of existence. Also, we picked up some excellent recipes for converting quantum uncertainty into coffee. Yes, well, we can discuss your experiences later. Right now we need your immediate assistance with several impossible situations that our standard response protocols appear to be making worse. Imagine that, Warrior said, her tone suggesting that she was in fact imagining it quite vividly. Elder Yathkala led them through corridors that occasionally existed in more than 3 dimensions, past emergency response teams that were trying to contain phenomena that actively resisted being contained, to a briefing room where the assembled experts looked like they'd been having a collective nervous breakdown for the better part of a standard month. The situation, began Elder Vextai, his aurora flickering with stress patterns that resembled abstract art, having a panic attack, began approximately 4 months ago when several sectors reported reality incursions consistent with unmarked territory phenomena. Initial response teams were dispatched according to standard protocols. How did that work out? Davin asked. The response teams are now existing in a state of temporal flux, and can only communicate with us on alternate Thursdays. Elder Quendara replied, her biochemical emanations smelling distinctly of administrative despair. We have since attempted to address the crisis using every established procedure in our databases. Elder Yathkala continued. Committee analysis, impact assessments, systematic evaluation protocols, and comprehensive strategic planning sessions. The situation has continued to deteriorate at an accelerating rate. So you decided to try unauthorized problem solving, Warrior observed. We decided, Elder Yathkala said with the sort of dignity that comes from watching one's entire worldview collapse in real time, to consult with individuals who have demonstrated experience in managing impossible situations through immediate, intuitive responses. Also known as, Warrior said helpfully, doing the right thing without permission. The silence that followed could have been packaged and sold as concentrated irony to developing civilization. Elder Ythkala's features managed to convey the sort of resignation that comes from having to ask for help from the very people you've spent years insisting were dangerously primitive. Yes, he said finally. We need you to help us by acting exactly as you always have, immediately without authorization, and in complete disregard for proper procedures. Warrior looked around the room, taking in the assembled representatives of galactic civilization's greatest minds, all of whom were basically asking her to save them by continuing to be human in the most human way possible. Well, she said, her smile carrying all the warmth of a supernova and twice the potential for catastrophic change. When you put it that way, how could we possibly refuse? And so it was that the galaxy's most advanced civilizations learned the most important lesson in their millions of years of existence. Sometimes the best response to the impossible is to find someone who doesn't know it's impossible, and let them handle it. The truly terrifying part was that it actually worked.